Single mom's daughter crashes elite restaurant, then the Mafia boss does something unbelievable. The crystal chandelier above table 7 cast fractured light across Lucia Bennett's trembling hands as she balanced the tray of champagne flutes. Her third week at Sapphire and Steel, Philadelphia's most exclusive dining establishment, and she still couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong among the marble columns and hushed conversations of people whose monthly wine budget exceeded her annual income. She'd taken this job out of desperation after the hospital bills from Maya's pneumonia had consumed every cent of her savings and maxed out the credit cards she'd sworn never to use. Single motherhood at 28 meant choices that felt less like decisions and more like survival instincts. Work 2 jobs, sleep 4 hours, repeat until something broke. Usually her spirit, occasionally her body, but never her resolve to give her 6-year-old daughter a life better than the one she'd inherited. The evening rush had settled into its rhythmic pulse. Servers gliding between tables, kitchen doors swinging with mechanical precision, the quiet murmur of wealth conducting its business over truffle risotto and aged Bordeaux. Lucia had learned to read the restaurant's social geography in her brief tenure. The corner booths belonged to tech executives closing deals. The window tables hosted anniversary couples pretending their marriages still held mystery. And table 7, positioned in the restaurant's most private alcove, served one man exclusively. Alessandro Russo. Even his name carried weight that made experienced servers check their posture before approaching. Lucia had been warned about him during training: never interrupt his conversations, never make eye contact unless addressed directly, never mistake his courtesy for permission to relax. The restaurant's owner, a nervous man named Gerald who wore his anxiety in the perpetual sheen of sweat on his forehead, had pulled her aside specifically to discuss Table 7 protocol. Mr. Russo values discretion above all else, Gerald had explained, his hands worrying at a dish towel like prayer beads. He's our most important patron. The restaurant exists because he allows it to exist. Understand? Lucia had nodded, understanding enough to know that some questions answered themselves if you paid attention. She'd noticed how other diners never claimed tables within 15 feet of Table 7. How conversations dropped to whispers when Alessandro entered. How even the kitchen staff moved differently when preparing his orders, as if carelessness might have consequences beyond unemployment. Tonight he sat with 3 men whose expensive suits couldn't quite mask the hardness in their eyes, the kind of men who'd seen violence and participated rather than fled. They spoke in low tones, occasionally glancing at documents spread across the white tablecloth with the casual authority of people accustomed to making decisions that altered lives they'd never meet. Lucia approached with the champagne, her practiced smile firmly in place despite the knot tightening in her stomach. She'd served their table twice already tonight without incident, but proximity to Alessandro still triggered instincts that whispered about danger dressed in Armani and Italian leather shoes. "Your champagne, gentlemen," she murmured, setting down glasses with hands that only trembled slightly. Alessandro's gaze lifted briefly, dark eyes that assessed and dismissed her in the span of a heartbeat. She'd become accustomed to that particular brand of invisibility, the way wealthy people looked through service workers as if they were animate furniture. It stung less now than it had during her first shifts, when she'd mistaken their indifference for personal judgment rather than systemic habit. She was turning to leave when the kitchen doors burst open with enough force to rattle glassware on nearby tables. Lucia froze, her training warring with instinct as a small figure darted into the dining room with security guards in pursuit. Maya. Her daughter's dark curls were disheveled from running, her coat, too thin for November, hanging open over the school uniform Lucia had mended twice this month. The girl's eyes scanned the restaurant with desperate focus before locking onto her mother's position, and then she was moving again, weaving between tables with the agility of childhood and absolute purpose. "Maya, what?" Lucia started, but her daughter collided with her legs hard enough to nearly knock them both down. "Mom, I'm sorry, I had to find you." Maya's words tumbled out in a breathless rush. "I went to your other job but they said you were here and I tried calling but your phone." "Sweetheart, you can't be here." Lucia crouched down, acutely aware of the attention now focused on them, of Gerald's face turning purple with mortification, of the security guards approaching with grim determination. "I'm working. You're supposed to be at Mrs. Chen's." "She fell, Mom. Mrs. Chen fell down the stairs and the ambulance came and I didn't know where to go and I was scared." The security guards reached them, one placing a heavy hand on Lucia's shoulder. You need to control your child." This is completely inappropriate. I understand. I'm so sorry. Just give me 1 minute to. There is no minute. You're both leaving. Now. The guard's grip tightened, already pulling Lucia upward while his partner reached for Maya. Don't touch her. Lucia's voice cracked with a mother's instinct overriding every survival instinct about keeping quiet and invisible. The scene had devolved into spectacle, Maya crying, Lucia pleading, security guards manhandling them both toward the exit while diners pretended not to stare at the entertainment their expensive meals had included as bonus theater. Lucia felt her face burning with humiliation, her mind already calculating how quickly unemployment would spiral into eviction, into hunger, into every nightmare scenario she'd been fighting to prevent. Stop. The single word cut through the chaos with such absolute authority that even the security guards froze mid-motion. Alessandro had risen from table 7, his presence somehow commanding despite never raising his voice or making threatening gestures. He moved toward them with unhurried steps that nonetheless covered ground with predatory efficiency. Mr. Russo, I apologize for this disruption. Gerald appeared from nowhere, wringing his hands. It won't happen again. She's fired, obviously, and we'll have them removed immediately. Alessandro's gaze silenced Gerald mid-grovel. He stopped directly in front of Lucia and Maya, studying them with the same analytical intensity he'd probably applied to the documents on his table. Up close, Lucia could see the silver threading his dark hair, the faint scar along his jawline that makeup or lighting had previously concealed, the absolute stillness that suggested violence held carefully in check. How old? He asked, his attention on Maya. 6, Lucia answered, unconsciously pulling her daughter closer. And the babysitter had an accident. Yes, I'm so sorry, sir. This will never happen again. I'll resign immediately, you don't need to. Take her to the staff break room, Alessandro interrupted, addressing the security guards whose grips had loosened significantly. Have someone bring food. Real food, not kitchen scraps. Gerald sputtered protests about protocol and standards, but Alessandro's slight turn in his direction ended the objections before they could fully form. The guards released Lucia and Maya, gesturing toward a door marked staff only with significantly more courtesy than they'd displayed moments earlier. Lucia hesitated, unsure whether this represented rescue or a different variety of disaster, but Maya's tear-stained face and her own exhaustion made decisions for her. She let the guards escort them to a cramped room lined with lockers and a battered sofa that had probably been expensive in 1987. Wait here, one guard instructed before closing the door and leaving them in fluorescent-lit silence. Maya collapsed onto the sofa, her earlier adrenaline draining away to reveal the terrified child beneath. Lucia sat beside her, wrapping arms around small shoulders while her own mind raced through scenarios that all seemed to end badly. Am I in trouble? Maya whispered. No, baby. You're not in trouble. Lucia kissed the top of her daughter's head, breathing in the strawberry shampoo scent that meant home and safety and everything worth protecting. You did the right thing finding me when you were scared. 10 minutes passed before the door opened again. A different woman entered, middle-aged, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to difficult situations. She carried a tray loaded with food that made Lucia's stomach clench with hunger she'd been ignoring for hours. For the little one, the woman said, setting down the tray. Chicken fingers, fries, apple juice. And for you, she produced a covered plate, the evening special. Mr. Russo's instructions. Lucia started to protest, to explain they couldn't possibly accept, but the woman was already leaving with a sympathetic smile that suggested she'd witnessed similar scenes before and knew when words were wasted on pride that couldn't afford itself. Maya attacked the chicken fingers with the enthusiasm of a 6-year-old who'd missed dinner. Lucia picked at her own food, tasting nothing despite the evident quality, her attention fixed on the closed door and wondering what came next. The answer arrived 30 minutes later when Alessandro himself entered the break room. His presence filled the small space, making the already cramped quarters feel claustrophobic. Maya looked up from her nearly empty plate, chicken finger frozen halfway to her mouth. Go wash your hands, Alessandro said to Maya, his tone neutral but somehow carrying expectation of obedience. Maya glanced at Lucia, who nodded permission. The girl slid off the sofa and disappeared into the adjacent bathroom, leaving mother and benefactor alone. I've spoken with Gerald, Alessandro began without preamble. You'll keep your position. Your daughter will be enrolled in the after-school program at St. Catherine's Elementary. They have extended hours and supervision until 7 p.m. The cost will be handled. Lucia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her mind struggling to process this sudden reversal. I don't understand. Why would you? Because children shouldn't be navigating public transportation alone when they are frightened. Because single mothers working multiple jobs to survive deserve better than termination for circumstances beyond their control. Because I can help, and choosing not to would make me complicit in outcomes I find unacceptable. The explanation came delivered in the same neutral tone he'd probably used discussing weather, but Lucia heard layers beneath, old wounds, personal history, convictions that had been tested and refined through experiences he'd never share with a stranger. I can't accept charity, she said quietly, even as every practical bone in her body screamed that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. It's not charity. It's an investment. Alessandro's gaze held hers with uncomfortable intensity. You're reliable, hardworking, and clearly dedicated to providing for your child. Those qualities are valuable. Consider this an employment benefit for exceptional staff. Maya emerged from the bathroom, her hands still damp from washing. She looked between the adults, sensing tension she couldn't quite interpret but understanding that important things were being decided. What do you say to Mr. Russo? Lucia prompted, because teaching gratitude mattered even when accepting help felt like swallowing broken glass. Thank you, Maya said solemnly, her 6-year-old voice carrying the gravity of someone who understood this stranger had changed something fundamental in their lives. Alessandro nodded once, then departed without further comment, leaving Lucia and Maya in the break room with half-eaten food and the beginning of a debt that couldn't be calculated in dollars alone. The after-school program at St. Catherine's transformed Lucia's existence from barely sustainable to almost manageable. Maya thrived in the structured environment, homework help, art projects, friends who weren't neighbors' children pressed into temporary childcare arrangements. Lucia continued working both jobs, but the constant terror about her daughter's safety diminished to background anxiety rather than acute panic. 3 weeks after the restaurant incident, Alessandro requested her specifically for Table 7 service. Lucia approached with professional courtesy and carefully maintained distance, aware that proximity to powerful people created obligations that could grow teeth when you least expected. Your daughter, Alessandro said as she set down his drink. How is she adjusting to the program? Very well, sir. Thank you for asking. The staff report she's excelling in mathematics. Advanced for her age. Lucia felt surprise ripple through her, not just that he'd inquired, but that he'd received detailed feedback as if monitoring Maya's progress held significance beyond casual interest. She's always been good with numbers. Gets that from her father, I think. Something shifted in Alessandro's expression, gone too quickly to read but suggesting she'd revealed more than intended with that admission. He didn't press for details about Maya's absent father, for which Lucia felt grateful. Some stories didn't improve with telling. The weeks accumulated into months. Winter descended on Philadelphia with characteristic brutality, gray skies and biting wind that made Lucia's walk from the bus stop to their apartment feel like Arctic expedition. The ancient heating system in their building cycled between barely functional and completely dead, leaving them shivering under every blanket they owned on the worst nights. Lucia returned home one January evening to find an envelope taped to their apartment door. Inside was a notice from building management about heating repairs, completed that afternoon, along with a card from a heating company she'd never contacted. No explanation, no invoice, just the quiet suggestion that someone had noticed their suffering and intervened. She stood in the hallway, envelope trembling in her hands, and understood with absolute certainty who had made the phone call that resulted in their first warm night in weeks. The knowledge settled into her chest alongside gratitude and discomfort. The growing awareness that Alessandro's protection extended beyond workplace benefits into personal territory that blurred boundaries she wasn't sure how to navigate. The restaurant incident occurred on a Wednesday in February, when Philadelphia's wealthy gathered at Sapphire and Steel for some charity gala that required special preparations and extended hours. Lucia had volunteered for the event. Triple pay meant catching up on Maya's medical bills that still arrived with depressing regularity. The evening progressed without incident until one of the guests, drunk on expensive wine and entitlement, decided that Lucia's professional courtesy represented personal interest. His hand found her waist as she served his table, then slid lower despite her subtle attempt to step away. "How about you bring the next round to my hotel room?" he slurred, his breath hot against her ear. "I'll make it worth your while." Lucia's training kicked in: smile politely, deflect without giving offense, extract herself before situations escalated. But the man's grip tightened, his other hand now attempting to pull her into his lap while his dinner companions laughed as if harassment constituted entertainment. "Sir, please," she started, her voice tight with controlled panic. "I said please," the man interrupted. "That's the magic word, right? So be a good girl, Anne." His sentence ended abruptly when Alessandro appeared behind him. No announcement, no warning, just sudden presence that radiated threat so palpable that nearby conversations died mid-word. Alessandro's hand landed on the drunk man's shoulder with enough pressure to make him yelp and release Lucia immediately. "You're leaving," Alessandro stated quietly. "Do you know who I am?" the man blustered, his bravado crumbling under Alessandro's unwavering stare. "I've donated millions to this organization. One phone call and I'll have you. Security will escort you out. Your donation will be refunded. You're banned from this establishment permanently." Alessandro's tone never rose above conversational volume, but somehow carried the weight of absolute finality. The man opened his mouth to argue, caught sight of whatever he saw in Alessandro's eyes, and apparently decided that retreat constituted victory. He gathered his belongings and fled with his embarrassed companions, leaving Lucia trembling with delayed reaction. "Thank you," she managed, her voice shakier than she'd have liked. Alessandro studied her with concern that seemed out of character for someone she'd always assumed viewed staff as interchangeable service providers. "Take the rest of the evening off. Paid. Go home to your daughter. I need the hours. You'll be paid for the full shift. This isn't negotiable." Lucia wanted to argue, to insist she could continue working, but exhaustion and the aftermath of violation made the decision for her. She nodded gratefully, collected her coat, and escaped into the February night where cold air finally let her breathe properly again. The envelope appeared in her work locker 2 days later, a gift card to Target for $200 and a handwritten note on heavy cardstock, "For Maya. Winter clothes. She's outgrown what you bought in October." No signature, but Alessandro's precise handwriting was unmistakable from the reservation lists she'd seen him annotating. Lucia sat in the break room holding the card, tears she'd been suppressing finally breaking through. Not just gratitude, though that certainly colored her reaction, but the overwhelming reality of being seen. Alessandro noticed things: Maya's growth spurt, Lucia's struggling heating system, the harassment she tried to handle professionally. He noticed and acted without requiring her to ask, preserving her dignity while providing help she desperately needed. The debt was growing, she realized. Not in money, he'd never suggest she owed payment in any traditional sense, but in obligation, in connection, in the slow accumulation of kindness that created bonds more binding than contracts. Spring arrived gradually, winter's grip loosening to reveal Philadelphia's reluctant optimism. Cherry blossoms appeared along the streets near St. Catherine's, and Maya brought home art projects featuring flowers and sunshine that Lucia taped to their refrigerator like evidence that hope still existed. The laundromat opened on a Tuesday morning in April, 2 blocks from their apartment. Lucia noticed it during her walk to the bus stop: fresh paint, new machines visible through clean windows, and a help-wanted sign that made her pause mid-step. She needed only one job now that Alessandro had ensured Maya's after-school care. The restaurant provided enough income to survive, though barely, but a second position closer to home would mean less commuting, more time with her daughter, breathing room in a budget that never allowed for unexpected expenses. The manager who interviewed her was a woman named Rosa, middle-aged with laugh lines and the practical bearing of someone who'd built success through hard work rather than lucky breaks. The position offered fair wages, flexible scheduling, and something in Rosa's knowing smile suggested the job had been created specifically with Lucia in mind. "Mr. Russo speaks highly of you," Rosa mentioned casually, confirming Lucia's suspicion about the laundromat's sudden appearance in her neighborhood. "He's generous," Lucia said carefully, unsure how to characterize Alessandro's role in her life. Employer seemed inadequate. Benefactor felt too formal. Guardian angel too presumptuous for someone whose protection likely came with expectations she couldn't yet see. She accepted the position and worked her first shift that weekend, learning the rhythm of commercial laundry and discovering unexpected satisfaction in the simple competence of clean clothes and satisfied customers. The work was honest, the hours manageable, and the proximity to home meant arriving when Maya needed help with homework rather than collapsing into bed too exhausted for conversation. Alessandro never mentioned the laundromat, never acknowledged his obvious involvement in its convenient location and timing. Their interactions at the restaurant remained professional. She served his table, he thanked her courteously, and they both maintained the fiction that their connection began and ended with employment. But Lucia knew better. She felt it in the weight of his attention when she entered his view, in the protective alertness of security staff who'd been instructed to ensure her safety, in the small improvements that appeared in her life with suspicious regularity, a reliable used car that replaced bus commutes, dental care for Maya that exceeded basic coverage, winter coats that arrived anonymously with perfect timing. The breaking point came in July, when Maya's elementary school sent home information about a summer enrichment program, 2 weeks of science camp that would cost more than Lucia earned in a month. Maya's face, studying those brochures with desperate longing she tried to hide, shattered something in Lucia's chest. She'd vowed never to ask Alessandro directly for help. Pride or survival instinct, she couldn't distinguish anymore, but requesting favors felt like crossing a line that would transform their undefined relationship into something transactional and ugly. But this was for Maya. And mothers made sacrifices that gutted them when their children's dreams hung in the balance. Lucia requested a private conversation with Alessandro after her shift ended on a quiet Tuesday evening. He agreed immediately, directing her to a small office behind the restaurant's wine cellar where they could speak without interruption. The summer program, she began without preamble, unable to maintain small talk when her hands were shaking. At St. Catherine's. I know you've already done so much, more than I could ever repay, but Maya wants to attend and I can't. Her voice cracked, betraying the humiliation of asking, I can't afford it. And I hate that I'm asking, hate that I keep needing help, but she's so smart and she deserves opportunities and I'm drowning trying to provide them. Stop. Alessandro's command was gentle but absolute. He rose from his desk, closing the distance between them with careful steps that gave her time to retreat if she chose. You don't need to explain. The program is paid. Registration processed this morning. Lucia's breath caught, somewhere between laugh and sob. How did you? I pay attention. His dark eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. To your daughter's interests. To your struggle despite working yourself to exhaustion. To opportunities that align with what Maya needs to thrive. Why? The question emerged as whisper. Why do you care about a waitress and her kid? What do you want from me? Something painful flickered across Alessandro's expression. Old grief, perhaps, or regret about roads not taken. I had a daughter once. Elena. She'd be 16 now if... He stopped, composing himself with visible effort. She loved science. Wanted to be an astronaut or marine biologist, depending on the week. And I was so focused on business, on building what I'd built, that I missed too many school events and bedtime stories. Told myself there would be time later to be the father she deserved. Lucia understood before he continued, the shape of his loss evident in the way his voice fractured around his daughter's name. There was no later. She got sick, leukemia, and by the time we caught it, treatment options had narrowed to hope and prayer. She died 3 years ago, and I'd give everything I've built to have one more day reading her terrible space adventure stories. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of how thoroughly children could break and remake you. Lucia found herself reaching for his hand, offering comfort to someone who'd provided so much without asking anything in return. I'm sorry, she said inadequately. I can't imagine that loss. Maya reminds me of Elena, Alessandro admitted. Not physically, but in her curiosity, her determination despite circumstances working against her. And you, he met Lucia's eyes directly. You're the mother I wish I'd let Elena's mother be instead of insisting she manage household while I managed business. You're present. Devoted. Working yourself to death to give your daughter chances I bought with money but never supplemented with time. Understanding crystallized for Lucia, not charity, not obligation, but Alessandro trying to rewrite history through proxy, giving Maya opportunities Elena never lived to claim. The knowledge shifted something fundamental in how she viewed his protection. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. For seeing us when we're trained to be invisible. For caring when you had every reason not to. Alessandro's thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture that felt more intimate than their relationship had previously allowed. You're not invisible, Lucia. You've never been invisible. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither seemed ready to name. Then Alessandro stepped back, professional distance reasserting itself, though something had undeniably changed in the space they occupied. Summer passed in a blur of Maya's excited stories about camp and Lucia's growing comfort in the dual rhythm of her jobs. The heat broke in September, bringing relief and the start of a new school year where Maya entered second grade with confidence that hadn't existed a year ago. Alessandro's attention remained constant but subtle, checking on Maya's academic progress, ensuring Lucia's car received maintenance before problems became crises, and occasionally sharing brief conversations that revealed depths behind his reserved exterior. He spoke about Elena sometimes, memories surfacing like treasures he'd kept locked away until finding someone safe enough to receive them. Lucia found herself looking forward to their interactions, no longer nervously anticipating table 7 but genuinely pleased when Alessandro arrived for dinner. She learned to read his moods in small details, the set of his shoulders telegraphing stress about business complications, the slight softening around his eyes when she mentioned Maya's latest achievement. The shift from gratitude to something more complex happened gradually, so slowly that Lucia couldn't identify the precise moment when Alessandro transformed from benefactor to friend to something she couldn't quite name but felt intensely whenever their eyes met across the restaurant. The danger arrived in October, when 3 men with Eastern European accents and expressions suggesting violence was their first language appeared at the laundromat. They interrogated Rosa about the owner, about finances, about Alessandro's name appearing in property records with aggressive curiosity that made customers flee and Rosa reach for the phone. Lucia called Alessandro immediately, her hands shaking as she described the situation. He arrived within 10 minutes, flanked by associates whose presence turned the would-be intimidators into uncertain men suddenly regretting their tactical error. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. The men departed rapidly, and Alessandro instructed his people to implement additional security measures. But the incident shattered Lucia's illusion of safety, forcing her to confront the reality of Alessandro's world, the parts he'd carefully kept hidden from her and Maya. Who were they? She demanded that evening, having asked Maya's friend's mother to cover pickup from St. Catherine's. What did they want? Alessandro's expression turned carefully neutral, the mask he wore for business sliding into place. Competitors. Testing boundaries. They won't return. Competitors in what, exactly? Lucia pressed, because ignorance had stopped being protection and started being liability. What business are you actually in, Alessandro? The use of his first name, something she'd avoided for 9 months, made him flinch slightly. He studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing truth against protection, before making a decision that visibly cost him. Import, export, he said carefully. Primarily legitimate, restaurants, real estate, construction. But some activities exist in grey areas where law and commerce don't align perfectly. I don't hurt innocents. Don't traffic in things that destroy lives. But I operate in spaces where violence is sometimes necessary for survival, and people who work with me understand that reality. Lucia absorbed this confirmation of what she'd suspected but never confronted directly. The careful language, the implied threat, the admission that his world included casualties. And by associating with you, by accepting your help, I've painted a target on myself and my daughter. Alessandro's jaw tightened. If I believed you were in genuine danger, I would never have. He stopped, frustration evident. You have my protection. That means something in this city. Those men won't return because they understand the cost of touching anyone I've declared under my care. What cost? Lucia asked quietly. One they're not willing to pay. The statement came delivered with absolute certainty that should have frightened her but somehow didn't. She should have been terrified, should have gathered Maya and disappeared into witness protection or another state or anywhere Alessandro's shadow couldn't reach. But looking at him now, seeing past the dangerous exterior to the grieving father trying to honor his daughter through protecting theirs, Lucia found fear mixing with something more complicated. I should walk away, she said. Take Maya somewhere safe and start over without debts I can't repay. You could, Alessandro agreed. I'd help you relocate if that's what you wanted. Ensure you had resources to rebuild somewhere else. You don't owe me anything, Lucia. Not servitude, not gratitude, not, he gestured helplessly, whatever you think this is. What is this? She asked, the question encompassing 9 months of accumulated kindness and growing connection. What are we? Alessandro moved closer, his hand rising to cup her face with surprising gentleness. I don't know. But I know I think about you and Maya constantly. Know that providing for you both has given me purpose I'd lost after Elena died. Know that seeing you makes breathing easier somehow. Lucia leaned into his touch, her own hand covering his. I'm terrified of your world. Of exposing Maya to danger I can't protect her from. But I'm also, she swallowed hard, I'm also falling for the man who notices when my daughter needs winter coats and treats harassing guests like capital offenses. And I don't know how to reconcile those things. You don't have to decide tonight, Alessandro said quietly. Or next week. Or next month. But know that whatever you choose, you and Maya will be cared for. That's not conditional on reciprocation or romantic attachment. That's permanent. The promise hung between them, heavy with implications that would take months to fully explore. Lucia nodded slowly, accepting the temporary reprieve from impossible decisions. Winter returned, marking a full year since Maya had burst into sapphire and steel, desperate and frightened. Lucia had kept both jobs, found rhythm in the dual work that provided stability without drowning her in exhaustion. Maya had thrived, second-grade report cards showed academic excellence, and her confidence had blossomed from the terrified child clinging to her mother's legs. Alessandro remained constant, present but not possessive, protective without being controlling. They'd begun sharing dinners occasionally, sometimes with Maya joining them, the three forming an unlikely family unit that defied conventional definition. On Maya's 7th birthday, Alessandro appeared at their apartment with a telescope that probably cost more than Lucia's monthly rent. Maya's screech of joy as she examined the equipment brought tears to Lucia's eyes and a rare, genuine smile to Alessandro's face. Elena would have loved this, he said quietly while Maya assembled the tripod with single-minded focus. Thank you, Lucia said, knowing the words inadequate for what he'd given her daughter, not just material gifts, but the freedom to dream without limitation. Thank you, Alessandro countered. For letting me be part of her life. For trusting me despite every reason not to. For, he paused, struggling with vulnerability, for making me remember why building something matters if there's no one to share it with. Lucia kissed him then, a brief press of lips that communicated what words couldn't carry, gratitude and affection and the tentative beginning of love that had grown from unlikely soil. Maya appeared in the doorway, clutching the telescope manual. Did you guys just kiss? Gross. But her grin suggested she found the development less disgusting than interesting. They laughed together, the three of them standing in Lucia's small apartment that had become home in ways their previous residents never had. Alessandro had given them stability and opportunity. Lucia had given Alessandro purpose and family. And Maya had given them both a reason to believe that second chances existed for people brave enough to accept them. The debt Lucia had worried about for a year had transformed into something else entirely, not obligation but connection, freely chosen and mutually treasured. She'd entered Alessandro's world through desperation, but she'd stayed because somewhere between winter and spring, between fear and trust, they'd built something worth protecting. And protection, Lucia had learned, came in many forms. Sometimes it looked like security teams and financial support. Sometimes it looked like gentle hands and patient understanding. Sometimes it looked like a grieving father and a struggling mother finding unexpected family in each other. The velvet debt had been paid in full, not through repayment but through transformation, from strangers to family, from survival to thriving, from separate brokenness to shared healing. Outside, snow began falling, blanketing Philadelphia in white. Inside, warmth radiated from three people who'd found each other through chaos and built something beautiful from the wreckage. Maya pressed her face against the window, telescope temporarily forgotten. Can we see stars in the snow? Alessandro crouched beside her, pointing toward breaks in the cloud cover. Sometimes the best views come after storms clear. You just have to be patient and watch carefully. Lucia joined them at the window, Alessandro's arm settling around her shoulders as Maya chatted about constellations she wanted to find. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer terrifying, filled with possibilities none of them had imagined a year ago. And somewhere in that moment, snow falling, child dreaming, adults finally breathing freely, they became the family they'd each needed but never knew how to ask for. The velvet debt was paid. The real journey was just beginning.